Welcome to the Rotary Club of Martinsburg podcast, where service meets community. I'm your host, Kevin Brackens, and I'm going to connect you with the people, stories, and projects that are making a difference here in West Virginia and beyond. At the Rotary Club of Martinsburg, we believe in service above self. Each week, we'll dive into conversations with local leaders, volunteers, and change makers who are driving positive change in our community. From community initiatives to global efforts, we're here to inform, inspire, and engage. This conversation is made possible by Brackens Painting. Brackens Painting is the region's best residential and commercial painting company. When schedule and quality count on Brackens. We've got you covered. Sharon Novak, welcome to the podcast. Thank you for being here.
You're very welcome.
It's a real honor to have you on. I've been looking forward to this for a while. Let's start with your background.
My background.
So, where are you from? Where were you born? School, education, family, anything like that. Tell me some of your history.
I was born in Clearfield County, Clearfield, Pennsylvania.
What's that near?
That is west of State College, Pennsylvania, the home of Penn State. It's roughly a 2.5-hour drive from here. I grew up there on my great-great-grandfather's estate. He had emigrated from England in 1850, prior to the Civil War.
Wow.
And when he came to the U.S. at that time, he was borrowed money from family members to set up a foundry business in town, because at that time they were building the railroad west from Pennsylvania out of New York. And they needed spikes and rails and all the implements, even for logging. So he had heard about it. So he made his journey to Pennsylvania. He was very much in love with Ella. Ella, his wife. To be his wife, he was engaged to in England. But he wasn't allowed to bring her because there were stories of renegade Indians and things that could happen. And the father-in-law to be did not want his daughter coming, not knowing even where she was going to live. So the tension and pressure that he had on him was to be successful in the business, but also to find land, build a home, and start it before he could bring her to the U.S.
That seems legitimate concerns. Yeah,
Yes.
I mean, definitely.
Considering what went on in those years.
Yeah, definitely.
It was quite a task that he had to do, but he did it in 4 years.
So he had the war broken out by the time he had started?
No,
or finished?
He emigrated here in 1850.
This was well before.
Well before the war. And he was able to bring Ella to the States in 1855.
Is that stories that were just passed down to you, or have you done some ancestry research?
It was actually written down by my great-great-grandfather, who my great-grandfather had it, and then my father had it. He had access to the diaries that were written. It was a very interesting life that he had. He was a very genteel man, and he believed in helping his neighbors. He prospered quite well. He lived 2 miles from the center of town where the courthouse was established. And so he could either walk it, or he could ride it on horseback, or take the buggy to town at that point.
Wow.
And so he hired local people, and he believed in going after people who were really downtrodden that needed a helping hand. In fact, many times he would give them money to start their homes, with the expectation of sometime, you don't have to, but sometime you may give it back to me or give it to the community.
So he may have been raised sort of in the same thing, because he borrowed money from family to make the move and to build a foundry. That's and quite possibly that's passed down generationally after him, right? That sort of
Yes.
That way of living. So tell me about your family directly.
My family directly, my parents were very well indoctrinated into being kind to each other, They were married very young, right after the Great Depression that struck. My father was a laborer. My mother actually quit high school because she couldn't even afford to buy clothes to go to school. So she met my father and she got married, and that was in 1937. And a year and a day later, my sister was born.
How many sisters and brothers do you have?
I have a late elder sister, and my brother is 16 months older than I am, is still living.
Okay.
And there was just the three of us.
What happened next?
Well, after my brother was born, then came me. And we were post-World War II babies, the baby boomers.
Sure.
And there was age difference between my sister, but not a big age difference between my brother and I.
Did your father serve?
My father did not serve. When the war broke out, the Second War, with Pearl Harbor being bombed, at his age, he was married and had a dependent. And at that point, he was working for Howe Leather Company, and they were making leather. And he went down to enlist, but he was told, Caston, we can't take you. A, you're too old. B, you have a dependent. And C, you're working already for the war effort of making leather.
Boots.
So, boots on the ground, leather belts. So he was gainfully employed all through the war years and even thereafter. Mm-hmm. But that was the main family income at that point, being a big laborer. Now, prior, his parents were well educated, but he, because of other children in the family and an ill father, he had to quit going to school and help be the income bearer. So he lost out on an opportunity, and he was forever telling us, I don't care if you have gray hair. I don't care to my brother whether you have long white whiskers. You will graduate from high school. That was his goal, at least graduate from high school.
That's awesome. Okay.
So that was instilled in me as a young person. He loved the outdoors, and he took us outdoors. We learned how to fish and hunt. I learned how to shoot a rifle. I learned how to fish. I learned how to shoot a bow and arrow. And learned how to grow a garden from both parents being right beside me, getting my hands in the dirt and explaining to me how food grew.
Sure. And
how we put it away. It was when I look back, when I was growing up, I thought, this is kind of strange, because my fellow students, children at that time, they had a different environment. Their environment, they were being reared by the guys that just came from the war. And so they didn't seem to be interested in growing things like my father was. But we had likes and dislikes. But I always thought, I'm different than the rest of them. And I used to come home and tell my dad that. And he said, I want you to be the way you are. And I want you to shine. And you are not to sit in the corner. You have to learn to do things for other people. And it was handed to me that way. My mother was the same way. Many times she would be cooking food for somebody who was ill, and part of it was there were no babysitters. You went with your mother or your father. So I went with her. So I used to watch very carefully what she did, and then I would watch the reaction of the people she had brought the food for, and it was just like so joyful. And my mother was very happy, and so I saw those expressions of how people felt and the good feeling that came from the fact that you were helping somebody else. I learned at a very young age of 4 years old.
Wow. 4 years old, Jesus. Those are great lessons. Do you remember, I'm trying to visualize this in my head as you're telling the story. I'm trying to make it a construct. What kind of food would she make for people?
Well, for the most part, she would make things that would probably last longer. She would make several things for them. A lot of times she did her own version of a pot roast, and then she would have other side vegetables, and sometimes she would make a soup, so that when she took the food to them, it was like they had a main meal, they would have leftovers, and then the soup they would have for other. So most of the time, they had at least 2 days of food. And
how old was your mom at that point?
My mother at that point was probably 28 or 29 years old.
Different times.
She was very young, but very responsible. And sometimes when I was growing up, sometimes we don't understand how old our parents are. I used to think my parents were ancient.
Yeah.
Because of the things that they did.
Yeah.
But as I got older, I realized that they really wasn't as ancient as what I thought they were. And as I got older, and I spent time with both my mother and father, also my sister. She was older, and she was so thankful that she had a little sister. I was like her little rag doll. She took me everywhere, and she taught me things.
What was the age difference?
There was 8.5 years between us.
So she was 13 and you were 4, that kind of thing?
Yeah.
Or 8. So 12 and 4. So, yeah, 15 and like 6. So that's a good pairing for a little sister.
Yeah, and it was fun because we did things. And she also was with my brother, too, and she was like the person that kept us on the even keel, and she taught us to share and to do things together. And I can hardly remember any time that I got into an argument with my brother. I was always looking after him. She taught me to look after him.
And he's slightly older.
He's 16 months older than I am.
Right.
But she said, boys are special. She said, you have to keep your eye on them.
Yeah.
And I used to think, until I got a little bit older, I understood what she was talking about, because they had a little more daring attitude.
Sharon, let me tell you something. I sit on this little front porch right here. There are 10 little boys on this street. 10. Varying ages of 12 to 5. It's a gang of scooters and skateboards, up and down, up and down, up and down. Sword fights, wrestle matches. I saw one kid having a sword fight with nobody, an imaginary person, and he was struck down and got knocked down and then popped up and ran away. Little boys, I have very, very little experience with children, and it's an amazing thing to watch from the safety of my front porch. I mean, they really are wild. There's some of them I actually call they're feral. I saw them standing on top of their dad's vehicle having a sword fight. I was like, they're going to get in trouble as bad boys.
Well, they have no fear.
Yeah.
And they are invincible.
Totally.
Now, that comes to play later on down the line of what I'll tell you. But my brother, at one time, he had seen, we had gone to the movies and we saw something like people jumping out of the planes, paratroopers and things like that. So he decided that he was going to get up on the roof of the one building that we had at home. It was called the Wood House. And he had made a parachute out of some loose clothing and string and twine that he had.
Oh, my goodness.
And all of a sudden I saw him going on the outside ladder to the building, and I said, why are you crawling up the building? And he says, I'm going to jump off the roof. And I said, no, you're not. That was the first real argument that we had. And I argued with him, and I said, I'm going to run and get Dad. And he said, you tattletale, you tattletale. And I said, you're going to get hurt, you'll kill yourself. No, I won't. And while he was crawling a ladder, I was running, and I couldn't get my dad. I got my mom. And she came out, and she got after him. And she said, don't you ever do that again. And she actually literally showed him what would happen if he would have fallen down. She had taken one of her little chickens that she had and took it up, and she threw it down to the ground. Now, the chicken bounced back. But she said, you're not a chicken. You don't have feathers. You're not going to bounce back. And so that knocked some sense into him. But at that point, I thought, well, he'll never forgive me because I ratted on him. And then a couple months or years, it could have been years later, he came to me and he said, is it all right if I do this? And I said, well, you're old enough, you can make that decision. And he said, well, I want your opinion because you know if I'm going to get hurt or not. And I looked at him and I said, what are you talking about? And he said, you saved my life one time. And I'd totally forgotten about it. When you're kids, you don't write those things down. So he had always come to me after that, as he grew older, and asked me, should I do this? It might not be jumping off the building with a play parachute. It may have been something else. He came to me during the Vietnam years and said, I know I'm either going to get drafted or I have to enlist. That's the way it was. What should I do? Which one should I choose? And I said, that I'm not certain of, because I said, I understand that when you sign on the dotted line, don't make any difference if you're in the Air Force, the Navy, the Marines, or the Army. You are putting your life out there to defend our country for our freedom. Mm-hmm. And I said, you may not come back. And I said, you're asking me to make that decision for you? I said, I can't do that.
It's too heavy, yeah.
I said, I really can't do that. So he finally, after talking to several people of his age group and older men, he enlisted in the Navy. He had a good time in the Navy. He enjoyed it. And he would write to me. At that time, we had no cell phones.
Of course.
There was no internet.
Right.
The only thing that you had was the mighty little pen and paper. But
I'm not that young. I remember those days.
But he and I would write letters, and I had more time than he did, but I wrote him a letter at the end of every day and sent it off to him, because we were very close.
That's really a wonderful relationship. Yeah.
And he would... every once in a while, he would know where he would be able to call home, and he wanted to make sure it was a certain hour so he could get to talk to every one of us. But he had a good time, and the worst time that he had is when he was in Vietnam. And the mail was much more frequent at that time, the way it came to the States. But the one thing he said, the water is so terrible, even it's treated, there's got to be some way to take the taste away. Ugh. Now, my older sister and I decided that we would go together, and we bought at the stores Kool-Aid packets. And we boxed up. I think we must have had about 250 Kool-Aid packets that we sent to him so that he and his buddies would have flavored water to drink.
That's really sweet.
And then Christmas came, and they said that they probably would be on board ship, even though they were stationed in the harbor of Da Nang. But because of where they were, there was no such thing as a little pine tree, a Christmas tree.
Sure.
But this time I was working. I had finished my college years, and I was working at my job. And I was talking to somebody, and I said, how in the world can we get a Christmas tree on board ship? And there was this one guy that I worked with, and he said, don't worry about it. We'll figure out how to do it. I said, so what do I do? And he says, well, go dig up a tree. We went out in the woods and dug up this little tiny pine tree and put it in a pot. Mm-hmm. I said, and my sister and I, once again, was involved in this, and we got little tiny decorations, and we put it, around.
Like about that tall?
About that tall. This is a live tree.
Yeah.
And, of course, everybody was laughing, and I said, this is probably for naught. By the time he gets it, it'll be dead. But at least the thought's there. And so the guy said to me, he said, don't you worry about it. So I had the tree, we had the decorations, and I went into his office, and I said, so why am I not to worry? He said, I'm taking it away from you now. This is my project. And I said, oh, and I had a little tiny camera, so I took photos of it. So I don't know his wherewithal and what he had. I didn't find out later that he was a retired naval officer at one point.
Oh, boy.
Didn't know anything about his background. So then he came to me and he said, the tree has landed. It's on the ship. I said, what? And he showed me photos that he had. Now, this was like months later because I had no idea if the tree would ever get there. And he said, look at this. He said the whole ship was happy that they got that tree.
Oh, my goodness. That's really sweet.
So some of those things bring tears to my eyes.
Sure, I'm sure they do.
But those are the things that, even though they were my family, I still continued to want to do those things for other people. It didn't make any difference if it was my brother or somebody else's family member. I went ahead and did those things because I knew how much joy it would bring to them and how close it would make them to feel about their family or people around them, because sometimes people really had some bad feelings about other people because of the way they were treated when they were younger.
Mm-hmm.
And if they were mistreated, they didn't believe anybody could help them. But if there was just that one person that did that one thing, it brought them back to say,
Changes everything, yeah.
There's good in mankind. So I continued to do that. And that was the story about my brother. I mean, we still have lots of stories, but
I got you.
that in particular. But between that and my parents, and of course the college years was something else, how I got into school. Right. Now you wanted to hear about, I said when we started this before we got on camera, if it wasn't for a Rotarian, I wouldn't even be here talking to you.
Right.
That person overheard me. I had a part-time job when I was in high school. I was interested in science, and I was employed.
Hold on. Do you want me to get you a tissue?
No, I'm fine.
Okay, cool. Carry on then.
I was very interested in science, and I knew I wanted to do something with science. And of course, at that time, you could be a nurse, you could be a doctor, you could be anything you wanted to be. But I didn't want to be a nurse. And I wasn't certain whether I really wanted to be a doctor, but I knew that science was the how-to, the wherefore.
Mm-hmm.
So I had read this thing because we had to do a report about a degree in science, getting something in science. So I read this article about medical laboratory scientists, and they worked in medical laboratories and what they did. And I thought, well, this sounds pretty interesting. So I wasn't just happy with what I read. I had to go find somebody that did it. So I asked our guidance counselor, who are these people? And she said, well, you need to go up to the hospital because they have a laboratory up there and they have somebody called a pathologist, and you could talk to her or him. So they worked with me and made arrangements, and I went and talked to her and found out it was her. It was Dr. Dorothea McClure. And I told her what I wanted to do and what I was. She said, well, I can tell you all about it. She said the best thing to do is come in and watch what they do. So I went in and I made observations and I took notes and I wrote a story to present to my teacher about a job in science. But not only that, I really got interested in it and saw what they were doing, and they were treating leukemia and they were analyzing tissues, and oh my goodness, it went on and on and on. And I said, what do I need to do? And she says, well, you're going to have to go to school. You're going to have to go to college to do this. And she said, there are shortcuts, but there is no shortcuts as far as I'm concerned. You can do it.
Mm-hmm.
I said, okay. And she said, all of a sudden she said, you don't work right now, do you? And I said, no. I said, I'd like to get a job. And she said, how would you like to work and do some menial work for us in the lab that would help those people out?
Mm-hmm.
So she never created this position until she saw me. So I became what they called a lab aide. At that time, we didn't have a lot of disposable things. We used to rewash things and put them in an autoclave. So I learned how to do that. And I would mop up the counters with a disinfectant. And in the meantime, I would grab books and start reading them, but having a good time did my task at hand. And so I decided I wanted to go into this more than I wanted to be a doctor. But I knew I had to go to college. Now, my father was a hard laborer, and he did not have the finances to put this child through college.
How old were you at this point?
I was, when I first started working there, I was 16 years old.
Okay.
And so I had applied to many schools in Pennsylvania. Every one I was accepted to. I was an outstanding student.
Explain the math to me, though. If you're 16, how have you graduated high school yet? Because that was a prerequisite of your father's.
Yeah. Well, I hadn't graduated yet.
Okay.
But I was going to graduate, and then, of course,
your futuristic
my
you're planning
futuristic plans
okay,
was
yeah.
to go to college.
Okay.
To be what I thought I wanted to be. So I kept thinking about this, and everybody said, you can do it, you can do it. I took college preparatory, but I was in high school instead of secretarial courses or anything that was going to be bookkeeping related. I wasn't interested in that. I was interested in science. So I was encouraged by my teachers. Same time, I don't think they ever really thought, we didn't talk about incomes years ago. They thought, well, she's got the means, the intelligence, she's probably going to find a way to get there. And of course, I knew what the financial situation was with my family. So I was talking to a colleague who was in a similar situation working in the hospital, and we were in a hallway waiting for the elevator to take us up to the next couple floors that we needed to get off. And he was asking me, and he said, do you think you're going to be able to go to school next year, to college? And I said, well, I don't know what's going to happen. I've got to find a way to get the finances. And I said, I don't think I'm going to go if I can't find financial assistance. I said, because my parents don't earn that kind of money. And so we got on the elevator, and there was a person behind me, and he was the radiologist. And we continued our conversation and shut up and got off the floor. And when I got off, he got off, and he turned around and looked at me, and he said, I want to see you in my office after your shift's over, very sternly. And I'm walking down the hall with Buddy, and I said, did we do something? I said, the way he said that, we must be in trouble. Maybe we're talking about stuff we shouldn't be talking about. So, of course, I reported to his office and told him who I was, and I was here to see Dr. Frederick Gilmore, who was a radiologist. And they said, yes, he's waiting for you. He'll be with you momentarily. So when I went in, he told me, he says, what do you want to do when you go to school? On to college. So I told him all about my background and what I wanted to do. And he said, that's a pretty good chunk of your life that you want to do that. And I said, but I don't think I'm going to do it because I don't have the money. And he said, you told me what you wanted to do. I want you to go home. And he said, I want you to write no more than 300 words, just like you told me, and bring it back to me. He said, I think I can find out how we can help you. And I said, well, thank you. I said, I thought I was going to get scolded in here. And he says, what for? I said, well, we were talking about personal things that we're not supposed to be talking about, our personal life in the elevator where patients can hear us. He said, well, I've overseen that. He said, that's okay. So I did what he asked, and I brought it back. And he said, okay, we're going to brush it up. And he said, now we're going to have you write it again. I'm going to bring it back and look at it again. And then we're going to send it. I said, who are we sending it to? He said, we're sending it to the United States Senator for Pennsylvania. Oh. I said, really? I said, well, they know avenues about student assistance. Trust me, is all he said.
Wow.
And I said, okay. So it's like maybe 4 weeks later, I get an envelope in the mail at home. And of course, it's at that time, I hardly, if it was a birthday card, I would get any mail. But I got this official looking envelope that came from the state capitol. And it was pretty thick. And of course, my dad picked up the mail and he said, what are you getting mail from the state capitol? I said, Dad, don't you remember? I said, between me and Dr. Gilmore, we sent this thing for possibly student aid. I said, maybe I'm getting a good answer. He said, looks like a lot of paperwork in that envelope. And I said, well, let's open it up and look at it together. So he and my mom and I looked at that, and he said, that's a lot of paperwork. And of course, my mother handled all that stuff. Alice, that was my mother's name, you're going to have to sit down and work with her on this. He said, I don't know all the answers. So I said, before we do it, I said, let me take it out to Dr. Gilmore so he can see it. And I said, at that time, we had copiers. And I said, we could copy it so I don't lose it. So he looked at it and he said, this is simple. He said, let me help you. And he said, the pieces I don't know, you take home because it's going to be your parents' income and your mom and dad knows that. So we sat together one evening and we just knocked her right out of the ballpark and got it all done except for the money piece. And he said, bring it back to me. We're going to mail it from my office here. So I did. And 4 months later, I got an answer back. I had a application guaranteed that if I took it to the bank in town, that I would have up to, at that time, that was a lot of money, $3,000 a year alone to go to college. Wow. And then there was another paper I could fill out for a possible state scholarship. So I was just enthusiastic. I was dancing all over the place.
I bet.
Because I would have never, ever had the opportunity had he not heard me.
Was
So
that doctor the Rotarian?
He was a Rotarian.
How about it?
I found out during the conversations we had.
What year was this?
This was in 1964.
How about it?
And I found out.
Conversation in an elevator.
In the elevator, how I met a Rotarian.
Wow.
But he was responsible for me and my endeavor of going into my career and going off to college. I kept in touch with him. I would write him letters and say, this is what we're doing and this is what I'm doing. And most of the time, if I got home on my breaks, I would see if I could get to talk to him because he was so instrumental
Sure.
in helping me go on into my career. And of course, at that time, when I graduated from my college, I had to do an internship. And when I finally started my job in 1969, I said, well, I would like to do what Fred does, be a Rotarian. But I found out women could not join Rotary.
Oh, that's right.
It wasn't until I think it was July 1989 when they finally allowed women to join Rotary. I mean, there was a series of events that went on, but finally at that point, they were allowed to become members.
Right.
Well, in 1969, I worked at the Altoona Hospital in Altoona, Pennsylvania. I had gone to college in Waynesburg College, now Waynesburg University. Had a wonderful good time. I was there on campus when we had some horrific events that occurred in our country, when Martin Luther King was killed, when Bobby Kennedy was killed. A horrific time to be going to school. There was so much protest.
Right.
The thing about what happened is I could write letters and I could say things in writings, but I wasn't allowed to carry a sign because the college said, we don't want you out there. We want to keep the good name of the college. And they meant what they said. If you do it, you're out.
Right.
So I thought, well, gee, I have this loan. I want to go to school, so I'm going to behave myself. But it didn't stop me from thinking that some of the things that we were doing was not the best thing in the world.
Right.
But I wasn't about to start carrying signs. So I managed to get through with nothing bad happening to me. But anyway.
That's a heck of a story.
Yeah. I can remember at that time, and there was, as we see on TV, there was such a thing as people who did not like certain things, and they were called the Klansmen.
Mm-hmm.
And they rode, and they put a cross on the campus. It was burning, and at that time, women had to stay in dormitories, and our house mother said, she made sure we were all there. She was yelling to find out if we were all in at that time, and she didn't want anything to happen to us. And so we stood and we watched with her. She was scared to death. And she said, don't you ever do anything. They will find out who you are. Don't you ever do anything. I was scared to death. I had heard about these things, but I'd never seen it. And so I just put it out of my mind and said, I'll just walk the chalk line.
Wow.
That was pretty scary at that time. And to go through that. And now, you have to remember, Waynesburg, Pennsylvania, is the southern part of Pennsylvania. We were only about 26 miles from Morgantown.
Okay.
Morgantown was the party town.
No doubt.
And when I was in college, a lot of the guys would like to go and have a good time. I did not like to drink. I hated the stuff. They knew it, and I had a driver's license. So they would recruit me to drive. I would drive, and they would have their good time and drive back. One time we were stopped by the state police, and the state policeman said, who's driving? And I said, me, I'm driving. And he said, I see you have your hands on the wheels. And he said, you're sitting in the driver's seat. And this was before mandatory seatbelts.
Right. They think you shifted over.
And that's what he was afraid of. And I said, no, I'm driving. And he said, get out. He said, get out of the car. And I stood there, and he started talking to me. And he said, yes. He said, you're driving. And he said, you haven't had one drink, have you? And I said, no. I said, the guys and the girls here, there was actually too many of us in one car.
I can picture it.
And I said, they like to have a good time, but I said, I'm concerned, so are they. I said, they're going to have to deal with it when they get on campus. I said, I can't answer for that, but I said I can make sure they get down and back safely. And he said, let me see your driver's license, I said. And he said, do you have the registration? And I said, yeah. I said, it's over here in the glove box. And I went over around the other side of the car, and I got the glove box. I put it and handed him the registration, and he said, you're pretty familiar with this vehicle. And I said, yeah. I said, it's my boyfriend's car. And I said, I'm familiar with the car. And he said, which one is your boyfriend? And I said, one sitting on the passenger seat over there, because I said, he's afraid, just like what's going to happen here. And he said, well, nothing's happening because A, you're sober, you have a driver's license, there's a valid registration. He said, just like you said, they're going to have to deal with this when they get back on campus. Get out of here.
Good for you.
And I'm telling you, I could feel the sweat dripping off of me.
I bet.
Because I kept thinking, what is he going to do to these other people? Because they're underage in Pennsylvania.
Was that still the late 60s or early 70s?
That was about my last year on campus. That was like 1968.
Okay.
And so that's
a different time.
It was a different time. And it was like, I'll never forget that. And I said, afterwards, they said, will you take us to Morgantown again? And I said, I don't have a problem with it. Just like I said, you guys are the ones that have to deal with it when we get back in town. Wow. I don't. I said, I just walk up the street and go into the dorm and go, and don't have to worry about whether I'm drinking or not. It was a rule that you couldn't drink, and they didn't want you, and that was it. So I said, I completed my task. They paid me. I was always looking for extra money to buy books.
Well, that makes sense. It's good to make money being the driver. That's good.
I back then, they paid me $25. That was a lot of money.
A trip?
Yeah.
Like $5 a rider, probably.
Yeah, something like that. Wow. That was big money.
It is big money back then. Good for you. Rake it in.
Learned how to be an entrepreneur at a young age.
Yeah, definitely.
But those were college years. I had a good time learning and a good time with my student friends. And
what's the next chapter?
The next chapter was my early years of working, and I started off in Altoona, Pennsylvania. Actually, I should say that the next chapter was doing my internship in Danville, Pennsylvania at Geisinger Medical Center. And that was so fascinating because that's where everything came together. That's where I saw the laboratory that I had worked in as an assistant. This is the laboratory that I'm going to be working at as a professional after having all these courses in biology and chemistry and physics and on and on and on. And so it was all clinical studies. And then you'd have the lectures, and then you go practice in the lab, and we're actually doing real work. And that was really interesting because they paid me. Right. They paid me a stipend. I didn't have to pay tuition. And the big deal was to me, I said, hey guys, I don't have to borrow the money, so I don't need the loan. But I said, I have this scholarship that I can't get rid of. Can you take it? Can you use it? Well, you're not really affiliated with the Penn State University that we have most of our students from. You're coming from another avenue. And I said, well, that's foolish if you can't use it. So I went to the pathologist and I said, talk to this person who's in charge of the student program, because I said, I think you may know how to get around this. So they did.
Okay.
They were able to use that money. They were able to acquire it, and they bought books for their library for the students.
That's good. That's real good.
So there's another example. If I can't use it, but I'm not going to let it go.
Right. That's
the benefit for
admirable,
for everybody. But we had a good time. There was 10 of us that went through the program, and I didn't have a car. And most of the ones, except for one, all had cars. So I was either walking or catching rides or
the designated driver.
Or the designated driver. They found out because they heard me tell the story, so I became a designated driver for many of them.
Nice.
At different times. But finally finished my clinical practice, and at that particular time there was the pathologist knew of other pathologists who were looking for laboratories people, and he said, I have a colleague that we had a lab together in Philadelphia that's dying to get somebody like you. I want you to go have an interview with them. So I went to see Dr. Robert McDuffie in Altoona and talked to him, and he said, we can have you start as soon as you're finished. He said, but I think you need a little break. He said, let's just shoot for August. You'll be done there in June. He said, you got to take your board, so let's just shoot for August. We'll start like the week before Labor Day. And he said, we'll give you a break. So I did. And he knew I was, from his information he got from his fellow pathologists, that I was pretty good at organizational skills and understanding the science and everything. I think I worked about 2 months as a general laboratorian, and he promoted me to supervisor because I was able to talk to people and get them to do what they needed to do without threatening them and educating them. And so 2 months as a regular laborer, and then for the rest of my life at that point, I was in management.
How about it?
And I got bored at times, and I worked different shifts, and I wanted to pay back the money that I had borrowed. And so I worked 2 jobs. I worked there full-time, part-time across the city at a Catholic hospital called Mercy. None of these hospitals exist in today's world. They've all been bought up by the big conglomerates.
Right.
But I worked there part-time, and then one time somebody convinced me to go down to Huntington, Pennsylvania, work in the little hospital called J.C. Blair. And then in the meantime, I drove as a volunteer for the American Red Cross, and we shifted blood back and forth from the major blood center, which was Johnstown at that time. And at night, facilities might need extra blood, so I became once or twice a week volunteer driver that would drive that blood from, say, go pick it up at Mercy Hospital and take it over to Tyrone Hospital.
Wow.
All by myself.
Sure.
No cell phones.
I get it. Yeah.
So that was fun, and then I got interested in being an EMT. And
EMT?
An EMT. So the guys knew that I was pretty good at driving and everything, and they said, why don't you come and ride with us? So I did. And then they said, well, you have to do this. Well, the EMT at that time, their ambulance service fell under the fire department. And the fire departments didn't want to keep them because of the insurance they had to have.
Okay.
So basically, they needed an ambulance service in the city. The fire departments wanted to give them up, so eventually the hospitals took them over. But before the hospital took it over, if you were an EMT or if you were any part of the medical rescue team, you were part of the fire department. You were part of the fire auxiliary. When things came to town, you went with the police. So you had to learn how to carry a firearm.
Oh, wow.
That was before the hospitals took them over. So it was kind of fun. I had to learn how to put out a fire. I had to learn how to shoot.
What an adventure.
What an adventure.
Yeah.
And so once the hospitals took them over, that kind of went away.
What age were you at this point?
At that point, I was 24. And I was surrounded by people that I could trust. Everybody was either in a hospital, a doctor, a nurse, or police officers, very trustworthy individuals. I was so busy I didn't have time to do any type of community service. I felt like I was already doing it.
Was this early 70s or this was still late 60s?
No, this was early 70s. This was about 1971, 72.
Okay.
I decided at one point, because of a failed relationship, what happened, that it was time for me to maybe work on my master's degree. So I put my head down and I enrolled in Penn State and started taking management classes. And then my profession offered a program. It was University Without Walls. And Central Michigan University in Mount Pleasant, Michigan was offering this through our profession. You would take and do all your homework first, and you would go get your class courses. Very pre online education today.
Right.
We used to get books sent to us by UPS.
Huh.
And we would work with our professors because they would want us to do, it was basically, I felt like I was doing a thesis for every course that we had.
Right.
You had all this assignment to do, and sometimes it was like, do something for your organization, like figure out what the problem is, and take it to your administrator and see what they say. I did a survey in the hospital, and we fixed the problem. And I got an A in the course for that.
That's very practical.
Yeah, it was very practical, and I enjoyed the courses, and I knew at that point when I was finished I was going to have a hard time working because I was interested in the professional part of what I was doing in the laboratory, but I was interested in the administration. But at that time, it was still a glass ceiling for women.
Absolutely, right.
And
I was going to ask you about that.
while I was traveling, because I would go to different places, I went to Texas, I was out in Portland, and I enjoyed it because I had racked up enough money in my savings that I could travel, get on a plane, and go. And I met many people that were interested in everything and changes and what was going to happen in our country. And somebody says, became very close to a person that was living in Houston, Texas. And she said, come down here. She said, you can use your laboratory medicine as your bread and butter job and search for some management job. So I went down there and I got employed at Methodist Hospital in Houston, Texas, and they hired me as the administrator for their blood center. And at that time, I was looking at, well, this place isn't making very much money. They're operating way in the red, and I gave a report. And the pathologist said, Dr. Michael DeBakey is not going to care about whether we're in the red or the black, Sharon. I said, why? And he said, that is an avenue for his family people to donate and do something for their loved one who's here for open heart surgery. They can donate blood. There's little else that they can do. But he's offered that to them. So he could care whether we're in the red or the black. I said, oh, that's interesting. So I met the famous open heart surgeon, Michael DeBakey, because he came down because we had to defer a family because they were living together and they had hepatitis at one point. And it wasn't over the time frame, so we had to defer them all. And they were all very upset because they were international and they really didn't understand. And so he came down and he was trying to talk to somebody to find out why this family was so upset that we couldn't take their blood. And I'm behind in my office and I'm hearing him talk. And I didn't know who it was at the time. And I thought the voice is getting louder. And the women's who was working in the center was getting louder. And I said, I better go out here and see what's cooking. So I went out and I said, may I help you, sir? And I knew he was a doctor, but he never told me who he was. And he didn't have an ID badge on. So he told me, and I said, well, I know the situation, and I said, this is why they were deferred, and I explained it very carefully and very thoroughly so that he would understand. And I said, I'm sorry that they think that we think there's something wrong with them. It's the disease that they've been exposed to. We don't want to give it to anybody else. And he said, okay. He said, I'll be able to talk to them now. So when he left, I thought, I bet you I'm going to be in deep, dark trouble with the big boss. So I no sooner got out of the conversation and one of my staff members said, you're wanted on the phone. So I got on the phone and here it was our medical director over the blood center. And she said, I understand you had a conversation with a physician. And I said, yes. And it was about family members being deferred. And I said, yes. And I said, am I in trouble? And she said, no. He was very pleased with the explanation you'd given to him. And she said, I just wanted to know, do you know who you were talking to? I said, I didn't have time to ask, but I said I didn't want him trouncing the staff. I was afraid it was going to happen. And she said, that was Michael DeBakey.
Huh.
I said, well, okay. He's no different than the rest of us. But every time I would see him, he would wave to me. And I was able to go in to the amphitheater and watch him do open heart surgery. But that was
you made an impression, yeah.
Yeah, it was pretty interesting. And so I was there for a year and a half, and I missed the East Coast. So I came back, and when I came back, I landed in Northern Virginia. And I went to work for the American Red Cross Blood Center in Washington, D.C.
Mm-hmm.
Same time, I applied for, I was still very interested in transfusion medicine, applied for their fellowship in a specialty, not knowing that I would get it or not. So I was working along, and all of a sudden they called me for an interview. And I went, and at this point, I'm 29 and a half. And I wasn't even thinking I would get it.
75?
Yeah. So I said, I don't think I'm going to get this, and I just, and all the people in the blood center, the hierarchy that wanted me there was saying, do you think you're going to get in? And I said, I don't know. They have all these people they have to accept an interview. They wanted me. Again, it was a free ride for me. They paid me.
Mm-hmm.
So I could work part-time. The agreement was, will you work part-time for us while you go to school? And I said, sure.
Wow. So
I did a year of fellowship.
How's that different than a master's?
Well, it's like post-master. I had finished my master's degree, and it was like there were credits that was awarded to us through Catholic University.
Okay.
Towards a master's in immunology.
So it'd be a second master's.
Second master's. So I decided to do it. In the meantime, it was wonderful, the program they had. You didn't stay at one place. You did your blood center experience at the Washington Regional Blood Center, but you went to National Naval Medical Center to see how the military did it. And then I did a clinical internship at George Washington University in their transfusion service. And then we did one at Washington Hospital Center. And then we were over at Fairfax. So we were all over the place. And so you got to know the community.
You were in Fairfax Hospital in 1975?
Yeah.
That's where I was born, in 1975. How about that?
So
now I'm crossing your path.
Now you're crossing my path. So in the meantime, I finished, and of course we had to do a project, and I did one on administration, how to administer a laboratory. And they thought I was going to write a book because they stopped me and they said, you're going to write? I said, no, I'm going to give an example of a manual that somebody should make for people who are in management in laboratories, because there really is no true course for them.
Okay.
So that was my project, and it was accepted, and it was fine. And same time we were applying for jobs, and I was interviewed in Ohio and California and Texas, and I don't know how many other places I applied for. And then everybody was after this position at Georgetown University Hospital. And one of my mentors said, well, Sharon, aren't you going to apply? Everybody else is. And I said, why not? Throw my hat in the ring. Just make it. I said there was like five or six, I don't know how many other people. They were looking for somebody to take over, somebody who had been their manager for their transfusion service since it started back in the 1950s.
Okay.
So everybody said, that'd be a wonderful opportunity. And I went over for an interview, and I went into their department, and I said, oh my God, this is like stepping back in time about 20 years. They were still making saline where you could purchase it. It was already made up, and there was just all kinds of things that was going through my mind. And I said, I don't think I want to come here to work. It was such a challenge.
It was too archaic, too much bureaucracy maybe?
Well, it's just archaic, and I wasn't certain at the time. And I went through and I interviewed and answered their questions. But then they kept calling me back, and I kept saying, why do they keep calling me back? Because there's one more person they wanted me to interview that was on vacation. So finally, the last person was the dean of the medical school. And I said, what does the dean of the... I finally asked the human resource person, what does the dean of the medical school have to do with my position? And they finally said, well, the dean of the medical center is John Bernard Henry. And I said, oh, that name's familiar. I said, he's... was the president of the American Association of Blood Banks at one time and a College of American Pathologists. And I said, so he's now dean of the medical school. And he said, he's trying to get that laboratory the way it's supposed to be.
Uh-oh. That piqued
your
interest.
So he wants to see you. I said, okay. So I went, and he had introduced himself to me, and he said, "You probably know who I am." And I said, "Yes, I do." And we sat in his office in rocking chairs. He loved to rock, and the old-fashioned rocker. So I sat there, and to me it was fun. I didn't feel like it was an interview. And he was asking me all these questions, and I said...
You weren't trying too hard.
Mm-mm. And I said to him, I see something familiar in your office. And he said, "What's that?" And I said, "You're a Rotarian, aren't you?" And he said, "Yes." He said, "Do you know anything about Rotary?" And I said, "I'll just tell you like this. If it wasn't for a Rotarian, I wouldn't be sitting here talking to you."
How about that?
He said, "Really?" So he wanted to hear the story. So he knew about Fred Gilmore.
Huh.
Because Fred Gilmore had aspired in Rotary, and he was doing all kinds of things. And later he became district governor over our district.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So John knew, and he said, "Well, you've done a lot of things." And he said, "You've done a lot of service in the community through your profession." I said, "Yes." And he said, finally he said, "It's time for me to go." And he said, "Are you going, where do you live?" And I said, "I live in Alexandria." He said, "Do you drive?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "I have a flight to catch to Syracuse. Could you drop me off at the airport?" And I thought, boy, this is strange. And I said, "Sure." So I pulled my car up around where the medical school office building was, and picked him up and dropped him off, took him where he wanted to go and dropped him off. And he said, "Thank you for the lift." And I said, "I'm glad I could assist you." And away he went. I was called 2 weeks later, and they wanted me to go to work for them.
Did you take it?
I took it.
Oh, wow.
Because it was after he talked to me and told me what he was trying to do with the laboratory.
You saw the vision.
I saw the vision. And so the vision was, we need to do this. And he said, "We need talent like you have."
What an honor.
When I took the job, I was honored and surprised. And it was
flattered.
A lot of work to do. But he was there for 4 years after that. And then he decided he had an opportunity to be president of Syracuse.
Oh, jeez.
And so he left. But all the time, his secretary that they had, he says, "Well, I am doing all this stuff that has to do with some silly thing called Rotary. What's it all about?" And I said, "It's not so silly." So I explained to everybody what Rotary was about. And they said, "How do you know?" And I said, "It impacted my life at one time." So I said, "He's a smart man." And I said, just remember who he is and where he came from." I said, "He's not going to be here that much longer. So if you really don't like him, there's going to be somebody that's going to replace him."
Right.
And we did get a good replacement when he left. But it was hard. And of course, I kept seeing him all the time later on in my lifetime. But that was... And of course, I remained at Georgetown in my profession after that for 39 and a half years.
Wow.
I developed things. I went on into making their first bone marrow transplant laboratory, where we cryopreserved the stem cells. And we went on to do special transfusions in babies and using ECMO procedures. And then later on, I took over histocompatibility operations, where we did all the testing for transplantation for kidneys and small bowel. And then we had some hotshot come in, and he wanted to do pancreatic islet transplants. And they said, "You're not setting up a laboratory until you talk to her."
Wow.
Everybody knew. I mean, I had run the gambit. I'd worked with research and development, and they used to say, "If you want to do anything, she knows how to do it."
From age 16, you've been working on this.
Yeah. So that was my last hurrah in my profession. I got them up and operational and had them accredited twice. And then I decided at that point it was time for me to draw a line and start doing things that Sharon wanted to do. It was like I had at that time had over 50 years in my career as a laboratorian, and I was not a doctor.
Right.
And it was interesting because everybody said, "Why didn't you ever become a doctor?" And I said, "Why? You don't really need to be that if you're doing what I'm doing. You work with them.
Right.
And you get them to do what they want to do." And it was, to me, it was very fascinating.
That is fascinating.
And
that's the word I was just thinking of.
I was, I was privileged to do that. And it seemed like it was an innate calling that I had.
That's absolutely wonderful that you could capitalize on that because of a conversation in an elevator.
And so now, let's step back to 1988 or 1983 when I met my late husband, Joseph.
Well, hold that note for a second.
Because that has to do with Rotary.
Hold on a second. I was not prepared for that long of a background story. Okay, we have approximately 7 minutes left.
Okay.
So you got to string it out just right for 7 minutes, okay?
Okay.
So go ahead and then try to tie in how you got involved with this Rotary Club.
So when I married my late husband, Joseph, he retired from the Foreign Service after we were married for several years. And we wanted to move someplace away from the hustle and the bustle of D.C.
Mm-hmm.
So we ended up coming to Martinsburg. 2 years after he had landed in Martinsburg, our neighbor invited him to Rotary. I came home and he said, would you like me to be, he said, is it all right if I become a Rotarian? And I jumped up and down and gave him a big hug. And I said, sure. And he says, well, that was unexpected. And I said, well, I know what Rotary's all about. So he became a Rotarian, and I worked with him. And that was in 1990 or 91. And I worked with him. Whatever he was assigned to do, I was right beside his side. Because I always wanted to be one, and it was the next best thing. In 2007, because the restrictions of attending every meeting all the time had laxed, I was able to join.
How about it?
And here I am. And I became part of Rotary, and one of the things that I enjoyed was the international committee, that we were able to interview the students and send them or receive them. And also the Apple Harvest Festival, because Joseph was always into everything. He was very good at organization and very good at building things, and he built several floats for Rotary.
That's awesome.
So here I am.
Well, we can't just end it that abruptly, Sharon. I mean, so in 07 is when you got to join, and was he still a member?
He was still a member.
Okay.
He stayed a member until 2011 when he died.
Okay.
And I was still a member, and even though I was still working professionally, I was able to attend at least sometimes twice a month and still stay involved in what we were doing. And then to my surprise, much later, a man fell into my life. His name was Samson Wright. And Samson and I got married, and I coached Samson into joining Rotary.
How about that? Yeah.
And he was involved. He wasn't in very much longer before he very unexpectedly died from COVID stuff.
Mm.
But he really liked what I was doing, and he understood what it was really all about, because he was about anything above himself.
Service above self.
Yeah.
Well, what do you feel like nowadays what do you feel like our club is successful at nowadays compared to what you saw when you first were able to join?
Where we are now, we are reaching out to individuals who are not just strictly business people. There are people who are involved in the community that may be working for businesses. Before, Rotary seemed to be more if you have a business.
Mm.
Now, it's if you want to do something in the community, and we see these people all the time, we can say, I think you would be good because you really want to do this. You want to be helping in the community. You want to do something. You have something to offer.
Make an impact.
And make an impact in the community. Mm-hmm. And I've seen this happen in probably the last 5 or 6 years, where we've taken this, and even the innate goodness that people had during COVID, I can see where Steve Roche served as president again, and so did Pam, because they wanted to keep it going. And many of the people who went through the Zoom meetings were interested in too. So that showed that this community and the people who were involved in Rotary didn't want it to die. And they still don't want it to die, and they're still out there recruiting people who have that same desire. And I think that's magnificent. And I've seen people that I wouldn't be able to see get involved in the organization. And as far as being involved with it as a professional, when I went out, I did, as part of my profession, would do quality assessments, and I traveled. I always looked to see if there was a Rotary and call them up and see if I could go to a meeting.
I do the same thing. I don't call them up yet, though. I just look to see if there is one and then sniff around and see if it correlates with my schedule. I would always love to see one in other areas. And I'm always, from my experience of talking to other Rotarians about their clubs, it's neat how they're all somewhat similar, but definitely different in one way or another, even on a foundational level. I'd say the final question I have for you would be, if somebody was thinking about joining, what traits should they have, and how would you encourage them to join? Like, what traits make a good Rotarian, and that's how you identify them, and then say, you've got to get to lunch.
The traits that they have to have is they have to be non-selfish.
Okay.
They have to be very oriented to being driven, being highly motivated, because the work that we do, we have to be motivated to do it. And you're not going to be somebody that's going to sit back and not get involved. You need to be ready to run. It's going to be your time, treasure, and talents that you're looking at, and to use those. And sometimes you have to switch those off. Sometimes you may not have the time, and your talent you can't give because you've got a conflict going on with family. I had that with myself and said, well, the best thing I can do at this point, I can give my treasure that I have. And I said, I can support them by giving them some sponsorship.
Yeah.
Where I wasn't able to. A lot of times it was like I was trading it off. I don't have this because I have family obligations, but I can give you my time.
Time, treasure, and
talent.
Yeah. That's awesome.
Those are the things that we have to have.
Time, treasure, and talent. So your time to be involved. Treasure would be financially giving within your means to the causes that you care the most about. And talent is your skill set, like me doing this podcast. That sort of thing.
Yes.
That was really a wonderful story, Sharon. Thank you for sharing that with us.
Oh, you're welcome.
Yeah. Is there anything you think we missed, we need to touch on?
Well, the only thing I think, if I remember, there's something that what could we do better?
Sure.
There's one thing that I see missing, and it could be there, but I'm just not seeing it. We don't have anything compact that tells everybody new coming in who we are, what we do, what is the expectation of a member. What do we expect of them? You know, at one time I mentioned that we had a mandatory have to be there meeting, and if you didn't, you had to make it up. Then we, over time, realized that that was deterring some of the people who could be part of a Rotary. But we really don't explain to that new member, well, you know, you need to be here once or twice a month, but you don't have to be here every single meeting. Or what is it that we have done in particular in a neat little package? When I recruited Joseph, I went to a couple on-site presence of Rotary and snippet what they had in a little 2 or 3 pages and said, okay, this is what we do in Martinsburg Rotary, or this is how we're involved with this. So I think we still need that. And many, many years ago, we used to have these little membership booklets that had everybody in it. Of course, now we have the Facebook pages, and we have
DACDB,
and you have all that stuff that you can go to, but there isn't anything really concise.
I get that. I'm trying to it won't be concise, but I'm trying to have a podcast at some point where people who've been in the club for a long time and are aware. I almost want to have a brag day. We just brag about, look, we did this 5 years ago, and then 4 years we did these, and then 3 years ago we did these. And it takes heavy involvement from our community to get these initiatives done.
And if anything, the person who still can't, probably has notes and everything, is Doug, who is a past secretary. Now, prior to him, Joseph was secretary. That was my late husband.
Wow.
And he was also on a board forever and ever.
Mm-hmm.
And I had file cabinet drawers full of Rotary stuff. And I finally asked Doug, I said, do you want this stuff? It was after Joseph had died.
Right.
And he said, no, I have this and I have that. I said, finally I threw it away.
Yeah.
Then recently somebody said something. I said, well, I shouldn't have thrown it away. Because it had all this stuff that we did.
The archives of our
archives
successes.
of what we did. So
Yeah.
really, before he gets too far gone, somebody should have him write it up.
Yeah, we'll look into it. I think his son is a budding member. He's trying to decide to join or not.
Because we don't own any real estate. We don't have offices.
Right.
So our personal office became Rotary things.
Right.
It was fun. I enjoy it. I still do.
Sharon, thank you so much for being on the podcast.
You're welcome.